Hello everyone, I want to thank you for attending this afternoon's event. My name is Javon Dominique Kafua and I work in the Office of Alumni Relations here at Northeastern University on the Alumni Engagement team. I help to coordinate this month's social justice programming for lifelong learning on demand. We appreciate you taking the time to join us today to cover the material from this month and also interact with our faculty expert, Jennifer Lammers. Jennifer is a university lecturer and an expert on the non-for-profit and philanthropic sectors. If you have any questions throughout today's session, please utilize the chat box on the lower right-hand corner of your screen, and we will answer them in the order received. I will now hand this off over to Jen.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking this lifelong learning class and for joining us today. I'm going to run a little bit of the agenda. For those of you who have engaged with material in the course, I hope you will find today's conversation helpful in connecting the dots and not necessarily just repeating the material as it's been covered. So we're going to look at the evolving nature of social change organizations. We're going to talk about where the money for social change comes from. We'll look at budgeting basics and total costs, which will be a recap of some of the material we covered in the session, and then end by looking at the bottom line and how we assess organizational sustainability for greatest impact. So first I want to talk about why I use the term social change and not just not-for-profit. Not-for-profit is simply classification. It is a type of incorporation recognized by the Internal Revenue System for organizations engaged in social good, community enrichment, education, and public well-being. And it's a tax status, and it definitely brings with it a fair amount of I will call structural and psychological burden for some people, and it really gets them caught up in thinking more about infrastructure and less about the work. And increasingly, we see that the work of social change, the work of supporting our communities, the work of creating the world in the form in which we wish it was, is not necessarily simply limited to organizations that qualify for a 501c3 tax classification. There are religious organizations which have always been engaged in social change. There are also increasingly social purpose businesses, and there is a wide variety of new classifications for transactional businesses, but whose purpose and methodology is primarily focused on social good. And we see these in the fields of housing and education and other areas where there is a embedded transactional nature. But we also see this in coffee companies and in manufacturing of apparel, where there are businesses with a secondary social goal. So they may be competing right alongside your traditional businesses, your traditional for-profits, but in their corporate identity, embedded in their sense of purpose, is a secondary social goal. In addition, in the class I teach, we also explore the rising importance of systems change work for social change, where we acknowledge that one organization or even one sector of the economy is insufficient to bring about social change or bring about wide-scale cultural shifts in how we approach our social problems or social needs. And so it's very important for organizations to look at themselves within a system and look at both their natural and perhaps unnatural partners. So the coalitions of businesses, government agencies, nonprofits, and community members really play a stronger force in creating social change over a long term. So given the various components of the social change network and the organizations out there looking at creating wide-scale change or enrichment for the communities in which we live, the question is, where do we find the financial support for this? And so for this, despite the fact that I've just discussed a significant number of additional players, I really want to look at where does the funding come for the traditional not-for-profit in this evolving sector. And so we're going to look at the funding that comes from private philanthropy, you, me, family foundations, corporate foundations, individuals and institutions under private ownership who make contributions to nonprofits. We're also going to look at the fact that increasingly nonprofits have clients and customers and engage in transactional relationships. And then there's the role of government agencies and government funding. So I'm happy to share this slide with you from Giving USA. And Giving USA is a statistical resource that annually compiles the Giving USA report by looking at tax returns and figuring out how much is given to not-for-profits in the United States and where that comes from, and ideally what type of organizations that supports. So there's a lot on this slide, and the slide will be made available to you after the presentation. And I'm not going to walk through each and every number, but I think the big ticket item here is that annually, and for probably the last 8 to 10 years, we have contributed in this country over $300 billion, and we are quickly approaching $400 billion annual contributions to the not-for-profit sector. And the overwhelming majority of that money, 265,000 in the last study, comes from income of total giving in private philanthropy, comes from individuals. And this is a really important take-home, because a lot of organizations tend to focus on the institutional donor, the grant maker, the corporate gift, when there's a lot more generally out there coming from private individuals, especially when you also look down and you see that 9% comes from bequests. And bequests is what we do with our long-term giving, our wills in our estates. So that 9% is still really coming from private individual financial support. I said I'm not going to walk you through every number on this chart, but the big takeaway here is that for probably the last 5, 7, maybe even longer, we've given as a country more than $300 billion to the not-for-profit sector. We're quickly approaching a $400 billion annual giving rate in the United States, with the overwhelming majority of that coming from individuals. In 2015, that was $265 billion, and that doesn't even include the additional $32 billion roughly that comes in the form of bequests, and that's from one's will or estate. When you leave a legacy as part of your estate. So 80% of the over $370 billion given comes at the control of individuals. On the other side of the chart, you can look at and see where the money is going. And overwhelmingly, religious organizations receive the bulk of private philanthropy, followed by education. And it's a quick drop off between 32% and 15%, and then it sort of moves its way down through other areas. And the reason I point this out is it's important for individuals who are engaged in social change work to understand the size or the priority level of the donor community. And it takes a lot to steer individual donors away from the organizations for which they are most familiar, which includes their churches, their alma maters, their universities, and their children's schools if they're in private school. So the way you seek that funding has to be particularly competitive, because there are natural go-tos even among the most generous. But that's okay too, because there are other sources of income in the sector, and increasingly we're seeing that earned revenue or transactional arrangements between clients and not-for-profit organization contributes about 3/4 of the revenue generated in the sector. So this may be in the form of tuition to nonprofit schools, camps, after-school programs. These are medical services fees. Most of our hospitals are not-for-profit still, although that's changing. And then government contracts. Government contracts represent a significant potential source of regular income for a variety of nonprofits. There's an Urban Institute study that found the government actually contracts over 350,000 contracts and grants, but does so with only about 56,000 organizations. So what this means is being an organization that receives government funding is a funding model. It is not something you do one-off or is something that you might, oh, hey, let's go after some government funding, even though 90% of our revenue has always been from individuals. The organizations that seek government funding are organizations that have become, by and large, experts in interacting and maintaining government. And on average, nonprofits that do contract with the government have 6 contracts or grants. So they're not just interacting with one government agency on one issue or one set of services. They've developed the infrastructure within their organization to support this type of revenue model. One of the things to look about when you think about government spending is that there tends to be a type of organization that is able to seek and maintain government contracts. It's not something that an organization enters into lightly, nor is it something that happens sort of this year we're going to have a government contract and then maybe next year we won't, and then maybe we'll cycle back in a couple of years. Seeking government funding tends to be a business model that organizations develop an expertise.
Hi, Jen again. Sorry, we cut off at the same point where you were talking about the expertise.
Okay, I'm back. So, and then I think the basic point here, which I think you can read from the slide, is that this is not a one-off type of relationship. The organizations that seek government funding tend to be organizations that have built an infrastructure to support such a relationship, and they become experts both in obtaining government contracts, applying for those grants, as well as in maintaining the reporting and tracking required to stay in good stead with these contracts. As we discussed in the course, and those who are familiar with the course materials know, government contracts bring with themselves their own level of challenges. They often require extensive reporting, both back to the original funding agency, as well as to any potential middle management or agency pass-through. A great deal of federal funds are awarded to a state agency or to a management not-for-profit who then subcontracts with numerous implementation agencies. And so if you're one of the little guys in the trickle down, you are required to not only meet the strictures of the initial contract with the federal agency, but to understand any unique reporting requirements of the middle pass-through agency or the local agency as well. I'm going to take a minute and just test. Are we doing well on sound? Excellent. In addition to the direct reporting and the day-to-day proving of your ability to carry out the services for which your agency might be contracted, the level of financial tracking with many government agencies and government funding sources is particularly high. They want to know that the funds allocated are being used as they were allocated, and that they are not being used for things that are specifically prohibited I've worked with clients whose funding source has prohibited what they call grassroots organizing. And then these organizations have had to walk a very fine line between what funds it used to hold public sessions or to do roundtables with community groups, because meeting with an unincorporated entity was being classified as grassroots organizing and not in carrying out the direct services of their program. But the organizations knew that if they didn't meet with and inform the public, they were going to be far less successful. So they actually had to raise additional funds for the public education component just in order to not run afoul of the funding season. A second level of financial tracking, which we went through more in detail in the course, was the fact that if you spend, not if you receive, but if you spend $750,000 or more in any fiscal year of federal funding, you actually have to have an additional A133 audit. This is a very detailed, very complex audit conducted by a CPA firm that looks at not just your financial infrastructure and use of funds, but walks through all of any unique strictures of a government contract to ensure that the organization is doing what it said it would do and is tracking its funds accordingly. A A133 audit can cost double a standard GAAP audit. In states where a GAAP audit is not required, your A133 may be your only audit. But in the states that require a GAAP audit, that means your organization is paying for and producing 2 financial audits a year. So takeaway is, unless you fully understand the costs of building in the infrastructure necessary, government contracts can cost a lot more than one thinks. And the cost of the infrastructure is not always covered in the budget or grant that you receive. I've worked with numerous organizations that have received million-dollar, multi-year government grants, only to discover that they need to raise secondary funding to support the capacity building and or the unfunded but related work that goes alongside making that government contract a success. So it's a buyer beware or a contractor beware sort of message here. Government funding is a huge source of support for the sector and provides a great deal of public good, but it's the savvy organization that can decide whether or not the funds on the table are sufficient to allow them to do the work successfully. So when we say a savvy organization, what do I mean? Well, budgeting goes a long way. If you do not know how much it costs to have a bookkeeper, or you don't know how much your bookkeeper can do in addition to what they're already doing, you may underestimate the cost of receiving or managing a government contract. You may underestimate the cost of running a particular program. And despite successful fundraising, despite receiving that government contract you worked hard to get, an organization can find itself finding it very hard to make ends meet. So budgeting goes a long way. And when we're talking about budgeting, we're not looking at just the budget for the particular program. A lot of organizations get caught up in what it costs to provide after-school programming for 100 kids. And they look at all of that, but they don't think about, in addition to support that after-school program, and to support the before-school warm breakfast program and the in-school lunchtime tutor program, there needs to be an operations manager. There needs to be someone who isn't necessarily day-to-day in the school or interacting with kids, but who is paying the bills, who is making sure that payroll rolls out, is making sure that supplies are purchased. And that person needs to be allocated across department and division budgets. And once you start looking at sort of the overhead and associated costs, you really get into the entire operational budget. What it costs for the organization to operate on a day-to-day basis with all both programmatic and administrative functions covered. What sort of capital purchases an organization needs. Does it need buses? Does it need to buy its own building? Does it have long-term equipment that it's going to hold for 5 to 7 years? And then what does it need literally to keep the lights on and the people paid on a day-to-day basis? Sometimes we can get into long-term relations with funders, but their disbursement calendar and our expense calendar don't always jive. And so it's really important for well-run organizations to not just know how much money it's going to raise in a given period or a given year, or how much money it's going to spend, but to look at where that spending and where that revenue may disconnect. Are you getting all of your funding in December, but doing all of your expenses around your summer camp in June, July, and August? If that's the case, you need to budget sufficiently to make sure you have cash on hand to do the day-to-day operations. And that's where you get to something called the business model. The business model says, well, how are we going to get our money? How are we going to provide our service? Are we going to be private philanthropy supported? Are we going to be an organization that has an expertise in government contracts? Or are we going to be an organization that functions on a fee-for-service model where we charge participants a tuition or a ticket price to participate in our programming? And then once we've decided that, how big do we want to be? Strategic plans ask us, so where are you today and where do you want your organization to go? And I always say that a strategic plan without a budget is just a dream. Without being able to put dollar signs behind the size of your expansion or the number of additional students you want to enroll, it's very unlikely that your organization will succeed in getting to where it wants to go. So with the idea that budgets hold all these different places within an organization, it's really important for those new to budgeting to understand that even experts begin with an educated guess. You take a guess at what you think it's going to cost, and then you temper that guess with historical knowledge. Did it cost us more or less than that before? If it cost us more than that, why do we think we can do it for less this year? If it cost us less than that, what are our assumptions about inflation and increased costs? We also look around and then make sure that both that educated guess and that historical knowledge is informed by what's going on around us currently. Is the economy booming? Is the economy booming? Are oil and gas prices up? Are housing prices up? What do we know about the world we're operating in that might temper our assumptions from previous years? And once we've done all that research, both specific to our organization and to the world around us, we write out a plan in dollar terms. And the plan looks like this in almost every iteration. You begin with your divide by source. So in the sector for us, it typically ends up contributions, earned revenue, interest. Some of those contributions are going to come in form of grants. Some of those are going to come from individuals. In most nonprofits, they separate that which they receive from an institutional funder from that which they receive from individual funders, because the costs and strategies to obtain those funds are very different. Every budget then presents its expense by category. And then we begin with personnel and benefits. So what do you pay your staff? And then what does it cost to pay taxes, healthcare, and any other benefits provided to them? And below that, and I say this in the class too, it amuses me to no end that accountants are so original that we have personnel and then everything else is, well, other than personnel. Anything that isn't your cost falls into the second half of your budget. And OTP or OTPS literally includes everything: rent, utilities, supplies, transportation, anything that your organization has to purchase that isn't for its people or providing benefit is OTP. A good budget then is realistic. It's not based on wild expectations and pipe dreams. You don't sit down and say, well, we only raised $15,000 last year, but we are going to raise $1 million this year. And that's how we'll balance our budget. That's just not realistic. Honestly, most organizations have to hit a 3-year cycle for private grants or government grants. Sort of put yourself out there, you build the relationship, and in the 3rd year, you might secure private funding. Individual campaigns are really fickle. Some years you may be the hot topic in the popular organization, and the following year, for reasons completely unpredictable, you might not. So budgets really be realistic and based on what you know you can do. Budgets are also consistent. You don't whimsically change your earned revenue calculations or your salary expectations just to make the budget balance. It's not an Excel game where you push up some numbers and reduce numbers. You have to have a methodology in place for how you're calculating your costs. And especially around personnel, the sector is required to have realistic and explainable salary costs. You cannot provide excess compensation without running afoul of the IRS, which means you have to do research into what you pay your top executives and be able to show that that salary is consistent with what other top executives in your subsector at organizations of your size and with the same expertise you're looking to hire actually has. Contrary to my last 2 statements about realistic and consistent, really successful budgets, ones that serve as a governing document for a successful organization, are also flexible. They are not budgeted to the absolute last dollar, such that if an unexpected change in gas prices comes into the organization and they have to spend more on their buses or the routes their vans take, their budget is bust. A flexible budget builds in contingencies. It has an overflow line item that allows the organization to say, if something happens out of the norm, we have a pocket of funds that will help us through that process. If something needs to be, we can do that. And that's a change for a lot of organizations that I've worked with. They were brought up in an era where zero-based budgeting was the requirement of funders and government agencies. The idea was that you spent every last cent you brought in during that year to provide your service. And if you didn't, then maybe you didn't need as much money. Maybe you needed a smaller grant. Maybe you could get by with less. And so a lot of organizations still cling to that, and they make these very tight budgets that only work if everything goes exactly as planned. But that's, as I said, changing. And a lot of reason that's changing is because the benefit of having a rainy day fund, the benefit of having contingency funding, because the world doesn't go the way we always think it will, is being seen and being valued, and is actually proving to allow for organizational longevity because they can weather storms, they can weather changes in the economy, they can weather downturns in the popularity of their particular issue or cause. Flexibility also offers you, if you have that contingency, the opportunity to seize on a great opportunity. If your organization is running a tight budget with no added funds and a neighboring building comes up for sale, you do not have the opportunity to buy it unless you fundraise, or the opportunity to provide your services in a new region or a new area is presented to you. You wouldn't be able to do it unless you fundraised first. So having some contingency funds, some flexibility within both your immediate and your long-term budget allows your organization to seize opportunities, to expand when it can, and to have greater impact when the moment presents. Just to keep in mind, as I said, for your annual budget, budgets build on each other. So you have a project or a program budget. That project or program budget rolls itself up into a larger department or divisional budget. From there, you run into the organizational budget. And those organizational budgets should really set out a grounding for any 3 to 5 year strategic plan. Sometimes I've worked with organizations where different departments or different projects have their own budgets, but when you try to meld them into the 3 to 5 year plan, you see that they don't necessarily comport. That not all the divisions within an organization, not all the projects or programs are using the same methodology, are talking to each other and ensuring that they're working up to one organizational vision. And that's really unfortunate because it's very hard to maintain stability and it's really hard to plan going forward if only when you begin to look at your strategic plans do you realize that one of your projects is a loss leader and you're funding it out of general funds and it's not supporting itself. So this is just to keep in mind, even if you're working individually within an organization on a small project and you come up with a budget, you need to make sure that that budget works with the larger budgets in which it is a component. In addition to talking in numbers and presenting the budgets as the ways presented in the class, it's very important that anyone presenting a budget also is able to give a narrative, a written explanation and or a verbal story that goes with those numbers. I'll tell you, across the board, even your funders are often intimidated by a complex numerical presentation. So you want to make it easy for anyone reading your budget to pick out the important details. You want to tell anyone looking at a budget, more than just handing them a piece of paper or a couple sheets of paper with the numbers on it. You want to include a one-page explanation of what is this budget for? This is a budget for the after-school program for the fiscal year 2017-2018 for the Chicago Charter School, which supports 258 to 18-year-olds. You want to also tell them what basis you're presenting this on. And this is a little technical, and if you've gone through the material in the course, you understand the difference between cash and accrual. But it's two different forms of accounting and two different ways of presenting your expenses that can seriously change what the numbers mean and what they say. So if you are looking at a budget and it's on cash, it means all you're seeing is money as it's coming in and money as it's going out. And it may mean that some of that cash there was more cash coming in a prior period or more expenses actually going out after the period you're looking at. So a cash budget could look balanced when if they were actually looking at accrual, which requires you to actually track the money that comes in with the expenses it's covering and prorate that, both that revenue and those expenses as they're actually used in the period, will give you a greater sense of an organization's well-being. We don't have time here to go through all of the details of cash and accrual, but it's really important for the savvy manager to understand that there is a difference. And if you will be making decisions based on a budget presented to you, understanding what cash and accrual are and how it changes the outcome. So just some takeaways on budgeting. Budgeting is not something that the skilled social change organization leader can leave to their CFO or outsource to their accounting firm. Skilled budget creation and budget management is as important as fundraising and certainly as important as program design. Because if you can't manage the funds, you're going to find it harder and harder to raise them, and you're not going to be able to implement the program design you dream of if you don't have money to pay the rent or pay your staff or buy your supplies. It's essential to know not just where money is going to come from, but over significant periods of time, both 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, you need to know where that money is being spent and to plan accordingly. And finally, financial communication, just being able to understand and communicate the financial reality of your organization is essential for a successful executive director or CEO. I have watched many organizations flounder because the executive director has been so about the passion, has been so about the services and the program, but is unable to explain to funders and the community how they're going to support that passion and vision in dollar terms. So you cannot outsource financial communication. You cannot outsource budgeting and financial management. As a successful not-for-profit or social change leader, you have to do the work and learn these skills. And honestly, they're not hard. We've been taught for years that, oh, math is hard and it's complicated and it can just be choosing. In their 60s and 70s, how to create an amazing budget and to communicate that budget in a compelling way to funders. I've taught people in their early 20s the same skill set. And it's just something that you have to accept that you need to know. And it goes hand in hand with achieving impact, and it goes hand in hand with achieving your goals. So we're going to shift a little bit in the last part of the discussion today and move from taking those numbers and how we create them into strategies for optimizing the use of our resources. So let's begin by saying that revenue and expenses, well, are essential to understanding and presenting. They're really only part of the story. And it's not enough just to know how much revenue you need. We have to understand what revenue sources are right for our organization based on its size, its history, its area of focus, because not all funding sources are equal. Some of them are very expensive to acquire. Gala revenues, fundraising event revenue, are really expensive. If an organization takes home 50 cents of every dollar donated at a gala after expenses, that's really good. So you can have an organization that raises $50,000 in one night at a gala, but they're only taking home $25,000. So that's really expensive money. Meanwhile, one grant proposal that took someone 20 hours to write may also bring in $50,000. And so the return on investment on a grant proposal is much higher. But not every organization is suited to receive a grant proposal, and not every organization is suited to throw a gala. So you need to understand what is the right way of acquiring funds for your organization. Similarly, not all programs that nonprofits execute contribute to their impact or further their mission in the same way. And sometimes we see organizations experience what we call mission creep, where they're an after-school program focused on girls, but there's a government opportunity, a government contract opportunity to offer a similar program for boys. And so they apply for that. And then there's a funder who's very interested in supporting young men in their launch phase from age 15 to 21. And since this is the not-for-profit that has the after-school program for boys, it's a logical fit for them to approach you and offer you grant money to do something in their niche. And so it happens. And then you look back at the organization's incorporation documents. You look back at the organization's mission statement, and its mission is to empower girls in the Lower East Side of New York. And 70% of their programming activity and 70% of what they're doing is focused on young boys. That doesn't mean they're wrong to do that work, but it does call into question whether or not they need to expand or change their mission. Sorry, thought we got two screens there. So how do you balance that? How do you balance the search for funds with adherence to mission and a commitment to impact? And that's increasingly being discussed as the dual bottom line for nonprofits and social change organizations. And the dual bottom line is a requirement that organizations find a balance between financial and societal returns of all of their activities. And it looks at both programmatic and fundraising activities within an organization. And it seeks to balance them and give them weight in relationship to each other and the organization's sustainability, so that you can make informed choices about where to invest and where to perhaps cut back or pivot. Working with a dual bottom line approach and systematically mapping both fundraising activities and programmatic activities can often reveal some really interesting truths about an organization that people haven't looked at previously. It often leads to the removing of sacred cows. Well, that was the first program we ever did, and we can't get rid of it. Or the founder loves the gala. It's their favorite part of the year. Well, if the gala isn't bringing in a return, or that program is no longer mission impactful, a board needs to have some serious conversations about that. One of the tools that we use in the course I teach and has gained some real success in the sector is something called the matrix map. And the matrix map is not actually brand new or all that revolutionary in that it's used quite often in business consulting to look at viability and investment opportunities. But what's really interesting is that a group of consultants and experts out of California really retooled the idea of a matrix map and set it within the not-for-profit context, where they created these two axes of financial management, where you could look at these programmatic and fundraising activities simultaneously on the same page. The first book that presented this was Nonprofit Sustainability, Making Strategic Decisions for Financial Viability. And this was really sort of the theory behind the matrix map. And then the next one, the Sustainability Mindset, is a workbook. And it actually walks organizations through the process of doing a sustainability assessment. The cool thing is, being nonprofits themselves, this consulting group put 90% of the materials needed to conduct an assessment online for free. So you can go to the website here, nonprofitsustainability.org, and access a great deal of the materials. That said, I would strongly recommend, if you think this might be a tool for your organization, the second book, The Sustainability Mindset, which is the one we use in the class currently, is a very useful tool. It's not something I use verbatim page for page when working with clients, but it's definitely provided me with a vision and a way of talking about things that I find helpful. And no, I'm in no way related to the people who created the books. I receive no pushback on this, but when I find something that works, I really like to share it. So these are the 4 quadrants of the matrix map as presented. And in the left, we have the heart, which is both profitable and has impact. Profitability is moving towards the right. Impact is moving from low to high, going up. So the heart is not its most profitable, but it has significant impact. Below the heart is the stop, which is neither impactful nor profitable. And unfortunately, yes, organizations often find that they have both fundraising activities and programs that fall into the stop quadrant, and they should close or spin them off to other organizations that may be able to do them more economically. The star is something that is both profitable and has high impact. And those are things that organizations should consider investing in or growing if appropriate. And the bottom quadrant, which is one that people sometimes philosophically have trouble with, is something that is incredibly profitable, but is lower on the impact. And unfortunately, some people say, well, if it's not directly contributing to mission, we shouldn't do it. But man, if you've got that popular t-shirt that you just knock the cover off the ball and it's selling like hotcakes, sell it. Because if that allows you to continue to produce a highly impactful but unprofitable program, having that cash cow is not a bad thing if it is managed appropriately and used to fund other more impactful activities. But you don't do it if it takes up all of your time and all of your resources, because then you're a for-profit business. This is the way a matrix map looks if it's been completed within an organization. And it's based on a multi-step process where you're looking at how much activities cost and what revenue is brought in, and mapping them along the axes of impact and profitability. In today's session, this is going to seem a little overwhelming, and I'm not asking you to A, either fully understand this map, or B, be able to produce one for your organization. but it is to show you what, if you did or someone at an organization on whose board you sat completed, could hand you and what it could tell you. So in this map, what we have is a organization that provides after-school tutoring, summer programming, job placement services, runs a community theater, has a sports leagues, and then runs a festival. Its primary source of revenue, it's green, is individual donations. It does not do a lot of institutional fundraising, and it does not have a traditional gala or fundraising event. So what we see is that individual donations in and of themselves don't have much mission impact, but they provide significant revenue. What we also see is that the after-school tutoring and the summer programming, those are at the core of what this organization does, but they themselves do not cover their own costs. They themselves do not provide revenue to support beyond even themselves. We see that the job placement program and the community theater actually do not have a significant profitability at all, and they have questionable impact. They are not necessarily in the sweet spot of this organization's education and stay in school mission. The real winner for this, and what seems to allow the organization to survive, is that it has a community festival, which is both on mission in that it provides a public outlet for performance and youth-led entrepreneurship, and it generates some income. So looking at that map, you see the organization's activities. As a board member or a stakeholder, you're provided with information about if we needed to cut, what would we cut, and if there were things that we could do better and invest more in, it would make sense to invest in. And so you end up with a key that looks something like this. Community festival, we should invest and grow. Sports league, looks like it's getting better and we should invest and grow. The after school and the summer programming, we should keep, but we should be very mindful of the costs because they do not produce enough income to support themselves. It seems clear that the organization probably could either eliminate or spin off its job placement service and its community theater. And finally, individual donations. As with most organizations that can successfully raise funds, you just need to keep investing in that process and streamline and increasing your efficiency and make sure that you are stewarding those gifts in a way that over time people are renewing and the gifts are growing. So as you can see, you go from I'm going to go back, a theoretical idea that everything we do falls into these quadrants, to an analysis that allows you to place these items on one sheet of paper in a conversation with your stakeholders that results in recommendations and a strategy for future growth and management of the organization. So in thinking about sustainability and thinking about the dual bottom line, the things I would like you to take away and the things I ask my students to take away is that it's not enough to have a board meeting or a discussion with your senior staff about fundraising. Fundraising in and of itself in isolation is only one component of an organization's holistic plan. And so strategic discussions need to be based on the dual bottom line, and they need to be based on an understanding of all of the organization's activities, both programmatic and revenue generating. One of the more basic takeaways that I think sometimes nonprofit managers forget is that they get so into the passion and they can deliver these speeches, but visual representations often help diverse stakeholders and staff at different levels within an organization see the big picture. So the matrix map really does put it all on one page and force the conversation. Organizational sustainability is not just about keeping doors open, and often we find larger organizations sort of get into this mindset of we employ 200 people and therefore we must continue to raise money so that we can continue to employ 200 people and we can keep the doors open. That's not why we exist. Nonprofits don't exist simply to continue operations. Nonprofits exist to change or enrich their community. And so in addition to keeping the lights on, we must hold ourselves to a higher standard of actually having impact. It's not enough just to pay our bills. It is not enough just to continue to stay at the same size or increase our staff size over time if we are not addressing the issues for which we were formed, if we are not ending homelessness, if we are not increasing literacy, if we are not creating programs that provide youth with a global international experience. So the dual bottom line is about trying to not just balance a budget, but to hold our sector and social change organizations to that higher standard. Because social change is not something that happens at a blink of an eye. It's not something any of the organizations we work with, work for, or support can do overnight. It requires a commitment to the long haul. And the long haul is only obtained if we are sustainable and consistent in being able to deliver programming, and we hold ourselves to asking the hard questions about priorities for how we're going to spend our limited resources in pursuit of our mission. So a good nonprofit manager is both dedicated and visionary, but also realistic and pragmatic. And they're not afraid of the hard questions, and they're not afraid of a course correction when needed. And I hope that some of the tools gained from this class, both the one I teach at Northeastern as well as the lifelong learning course that you have all decided to engage with, helps you open yourself up to those hard questions and provides a framework for how you might be able to help those organizations you care about and those causes you support commit to the long haul and be there to be the change we seek. So, concluding thoughts, there's no one way to raise money for social change, and you have to know the organization's mission, structure, and context to make the right choices. Don't join a board and say, oh, the last organization I was with had a great gala. We should have a gala too, until you know whether or not a gala is an appropriate tool for raising money. Or don't say, hey, I think there are government contracts that we should go after because it's, $500,000 or $1 million. That may not be right for that organization. And just in the end, it's not easy. If anybody tells you that running a nonprofit is easy, they're lying or they're naive. Because if it was easy, we wouldn't have hunger. We wouldn't have illiteracy. We wouldn't have social conflict. This is a difficult thing to do. It is difficult to commit yourself to problems that have been around for hundreds of years. But the only way we're going to make a difference is if we are willing to approach these problems in a rational and pragmatic manner, but never losing sight of the fact that we do have the power to affect change, both small in our communities and globally in our world. And it's a commitment to both that bigger vision and the nitty-gritty details that really will make the difference. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them. If not now, then through other communication via email later on.
Jen, thanks for that. That was a very impactful presentation about social justice. A quick question that I have here is, how often do you tend to evaluate programming? Is it usually with your annual budget review? Is it every 6 months, or is there another sort of time frame that you typically tend to use?
So there are two philosophies, and increasingly they run simultaneous. Most organizations do adhere to an annual review and then a 3 to 5 year plan when they do a strategic plan. But within that, there's sort of the need to constantly be pegging yourself and checking to make sure you're going the right direction. If you owe every 12 months, you could find yourself way off course by the first time you look. So periodically, and with financial statements, I would say it's often monthly. You're making sure you're on course with your budget, and most definitely every 6 months that you do a whole scale budget to actual presentation. As to program impact, that's probably an annual checkup with a 18 months to 2-year board stakeholder discussion.
Got it. That makes sense to keep in mind when evaluating. Does anyone else have any additional questions that they would like to ask? Okay, so if not, we can go ahead and wrap up the session. So this month's social justice content will all be on our website through our archive, where all of the information and content will be available. And thanks again for everyone for joining us today, and for Jen to take the time out of her day to also present. So thank you very much again, and enjoy the rest of your day.